So traditionally, if I wanted to position an element relative to another element, what I would do is I would just put the two elements close to each other in the DOM and simply position one element absolutely relative to some sort of shared parent container, and that's worked really well. But it does limit some of the user experience that I can create by forcing the absolutely positioned element to be far down in the document object model. So to experiment with a different type of user experience, what I want to do is create an absolute positioned element that I'm calling my anchor, and I want to position this, which is a fixed position element called pop-up, relative to the anchor. So this is, let me just show you in the CSS here. So the anchor is position absolute and the pop-up is position fixed. So these exist in two completely different coordinate planes, but I want to be able to position this one relative, so to speak, to this one, but at the same time I also want to constrain this one to the viewport. So let's go into the browser and just see what I'm trying to achieve before we look at the code. So here's my anchor, and as I click and start to drag, you can see that my pop-up shows up. But as I move towards the edges of the browser, what you'll notice is that the pop-up location is being constrained by the viewport, right? And it'll do this on every edge as I move my little draggy guy around. And then even as I scroll, you'll see that the pop-up, which is again fixed position, is still relative to the anchor, which is absolutely positioned to the document root. And you can see I'm dragging this around, and we get that continued constraining based on the viewport, right? So let's take a look in the code to see how this works. So first, what I'm going to be doing is injecting the pop-up ref and the anchor ref. These are actual references to the elements within the view. And then when I mouse down on the anchor, I'm going to get its fixed position coordinates within the viewport so that I can figure out where the mouse is relative to the edge, right? Because what happens is when I click kind of in the middle of the thing and start to drag, what you'll notice is that my mouse still remains sort of middle of the anchor here. If I can do it on the bottom, if I can do it on the top. And essentially what I'm doing is using this mouse offset, which is the sort of left and top from the top left of the anchor, to maintain that relative positioning to the user's mouse. Now that's just a nicety, but really what the mouse down does is set up the mouse move and mouse up events which handle the drag. Really most of it is just in the mouse move. So let's take a look at the mouse move. So when the user starts to move their mouse around, the first thing I do is position the anchor itself. So first I look at the client X and client Y. These are the mouse coordinates within the browser's viewport. And then I make it relative based on that mouse offset, which is what we just talked about. But then mostly I'm taking into account the page X offset and the page Y offset, which is the scroll offset of the browser itself. So essentially I'm taking the viewport coordinates plus the window scroll to get the new position of the anchor. And that's what allows this thing to follow the mouse. Okay, next I have to position the pop-up. So the pop-up, I get the coordinates and the dimensions of the pop-up based on the bounding client rectangle. So that's going to be the coordinates within the browser's viewport, and from that I can get the width and the height. And then of course we're going to constrain this based on the window width and the window height, right? That's the viewport, because I want to keep the pop-up within the viewport. Now first I want to get what I call the natural left and the natural top, meaning that's the location of that pop-up relative to the anchor, regardless of whether or not it's being constrained by one of the edges, right? And all we have to do there is get the position that we've already calculated for the anchor and add the scroll offset to essentially take this as a document level coordinate and translate it into a viewport level coordinate. And again, I could have really made this much more simple for myself if I just had the get bounding client rect of the anchor, because I wouldn't have to adjust for the page scroll. Whatever, I can do that in a follow-up experiment. But then I want to figure out what the sort of local minimum and maximum for the viewport would be. I want to keep it 10 pixels away from the viewport, and then essentially I'm just positioning here based on those minimums and those maximums, And then I know that the pop-up is being constrained if the natural left and natural top don't match the calculated left and the calculated top. And that's pretty much all there is in this demo. So really the meat of it is just this one mouse move method, which calculates the position of the anchor, calculates the position of the pop-up relative to the anchor, but then also constrains that pop-up based on the dimensions of the viewport. And again, what we get here is this ability to track the pop-up near the anchor, but then to constrain the pop-up as we hit the edges of the viewport such that the pop-up never overlaps with one of the edges of the viewport.